the other dictatorship, okay, the dictatorship which actually is not being discussed, okay, and no one is actually outraged about it except for the handful of meaningful leftists, okay, but no one's outraged about it. And we do live in circumstances of dictatorship of corporations, so corporate dictatorship, or dictatorship sometimes that is exercised like dictatorial measures are being applied by intelligence services or all kinds of stuff, right? Everything's happening, but this is the reality of the capitalist class society, where you have the dictatorship of one class over the other class, and it's not that visible because the capitalist class, the managerial class, the bourgeois class, to use the classical Marxist language, okay, they own this, they own the countries, they own the states, they own the economy, they own the judiciary, they own the media, they own the army, they own the police, and so on and so forth, right? The list is long. So this is something that I think, the fact that people do not really, the fact that this dictatorship is not part of the public discourse is also speaks to the weakness of the left, okay? Because for the last 30 years, I can't really see any major leftist, media outlet or propaganda center, circle, whatever, to come up and try to inject this sort of discourse into the public sphere, okay? So this is also, to a certain extent, our failure. And of course, like, I'm not trying to blame the left for the existence of capitalism right now, but what I'm trying to say is that there are problems with authoritarian rule and with authoritarian regime which aren't so easily detectable because they are not being discussed by the mainstream. And I think that Bulgaria, and I want to go to Vladimir now, Bulgaria is an excellent example because despite the fact that our authoritarianism there has been quite overt, actually, for anyone who has been there or for anyone who has actually had a closer look at how things are in Bulgaria and how there is no rule of law, how there's widespread corruption, how Boyko Borisov has been, basically something like an absolute leader. Okay, I mean absolutist. I guess the proper term is absolutist leader, because he basically was able to manually manage every institution of the country at every level through his party, which was organized all around him, which wasn't really a normal party, and it has never been. It was something like a secret service / police club. That's what it was, really. And he was the commander of that club, and then it kind of grew into the institutional structure of the country, and basically turned from this police club into a kind of corporation that was policing everything, and in particular was acting against people and processes and organizations that would even remotely threaten, okay, the oligarchic model that is Boyko Borisov and his oligarchic friends managing everything and owning the economy and so on and so forth. And so we've seen that, but no one really paid much of an attention. And I think, Vladimir, you've already explained it to a certain extent by pointing out that that Boyko Borisov was had a very cozy relationship, and the authoritarian leader had a very cozy relationship with the democratic leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, plus with foreign investors. Okay, so you can see foreign investors and Angela Merkel, if things are okay, if they are okay with a certain type of authoritarianism, that's fine. If it suits their goals, okay, that's fine. Then we don't write about it on the front page of Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or whatever other mainstream media. But when we don't like someone like Lukashenko, for example, then, oh my God, my heart goes out. Our hearts go out, right? Because there is a protest movement crashed last year in Belarus. But what's actually, substantially speaking, what's the difference, okay, between a movement crushed, okay, and a movement that's been crushed in a softer manner, like in Bulgaria? Because at pretty much the same time, in Bulgaria and in Belarus, we had very strong and I would say even well-organized protests, okay, massive protests, on an everyday basis, or almost everyday basis. And in Bulgaria, they lasted for almost half a year. Okay, half a year, masses of people every day on the streets, and crickets in the media, right? And what's actually the difference between that authoritarianism and this and the other authoritarianism? When both of the movements have achieved pretty much nothing, with the exception, and here I want to go to you, Vladimir, that some organizations, okay, some of them new, some of them pretending to be new, political organizations did emerge around the protests in Bulgaria, and they are now part of the parliamentary game. But I think it has to be pointed out that had there not been the American blessing for that, it would have never happened. It's not because the authoritarianism of Boyko Borisov was better, okay? It's because the Americans withdrew in the last moment, I was going to say, but I don't think it was the last moment, really. It was just their choice of the right moment. Okay, they withdrew their support for Boyko Borisov, and they started looking for a new viceroy on the ground. And had it not been for this, had it not been for the allowance from the side of the American embassy, I think, okay, it would have never happened, or at least not to such an extent, where we have a party that claims to have been created, I think quite falsely, by the way, but that's a different story, claims to have been created on the basis of those protests last year, winning the parliamentary elections, okay? So please, tell us, why do you think this authoritarianism was? Because, in my opinion, it's like, people voted, and that's, of course, one of the aspects why they voted for Boyko Borisov and this authoritarian appeal that he had. There are many reasons for that, but one reason, definitely, in a kind of historical perspective, is that before 1989, people have obviously lived better lives than after 1989, and everyone is going to tell you this in Bulgaria, with the exception of of a small group of absolutely anti-communist, obsessively anti-communist right-wingers in Sofia and maybe other urban centers. But everyone understands, and this is a consensus in Bulgaria, that the transition failed. Okay, totally, and has failed the people, and failed morally, economically, ethically, politically, in every aspect, really. Okay, but then I think it's logical for the people to make such a choice because they've lived a better life under the authoritarian regime before 1989, and then they had this allegedly democratic experiment, okay, imposed on them. Which was really, the democracy was just the decorum, because what was introduced was capitalism, not so much democracy. So they've had this, and the results of that they have been terrible. Terrible. People don't realize, particularly the American audience and the Canadian audience, the North American audience, that is the that the analysis appeals to mostly. I don't think they even have the slightest idea what kind of civilizational downgrade and destitution we have been through in Bulgaria. And, now people, vote again for someone with an authoritarian appeal because it's just, kind of logical. I don't support that, okay? But it is logical, isn't it? What's your take?
You spoke a long time, so I have plenty of issues to tackle now.
Please go ahead.
First of all, one reason for this overly personal regime of Borisov to stand for a long time, obviously, is the international one, as we spoke. And maybe it's exactly the fact that he came in politics through the internal ministry, and he has this impression of somebody who can instill discipline, at least on a very physical level, let's say even on the street, if you wish. Maybe that has been important for his partners in the West, because I guess the West needs its flows of good investment funds, etc., to travel freely through this land, which is Bulgaria. So the territory is important, and it is important to be stable. But also, I think it's the economical reason that has been important explanation for this long-standing rule of Borisov. And here I need to expand a little bit more the issue, because we have something which also in Romania it's present, Maybe it's like that in a number of countries in the region. Maybe it's something which is called clientelist connections or networks. So there have been a lot of cases when, for example, workers in a large factory or firm, they are put by their employer to protest because the interests of the firm are violated. And there are a number of situations in which people just they perceive their economic interest in a very physical, direct way as related to the interest of their patron. Maybe it could be the boss of the firm, it could be the boss of the party which their firm is aligned to. So it is we speak about authoritarianism. Well, that is exactly a feudal structure of society. So if I'm a Western, I don't know, if I come from the West and I want to change something in Bulgaria, I have to make an effort to change this model, the social model, to have more people who are economically independent or who are critically in their approaches to the society, who are not tempted to give in their freedom or trust easily. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the regime of Borisov lasted for so long. And why did it start to unravel? Well, I guess the reason is again economical, especially on the internal part of the the Bulgarian part of the explanation, because it got strengthened a lot under Trump. And as a result of that, a limited number of firms started winning a large number of public procurement for any kind of services like highways or other services in which state money are channeled to the private sector. So first of all, a number of businesses fell out of the game. They couldn't. It turned out that you can run your business only as long as you have the support of a certain party which is in government. And if you don't have support among those parties, your business is very likely to go into bankruptcy. And another reason, at least as far as I got some impressions from people in Sofia when there were protests in the last summer, 1 year ago, it looked like even those elites which are traditionally pro-European, related to the NGO sector, at least there is such an opinion that they started feeling they're losing their ground in comparison to the GERB elites in obtaining certain European funds. So I guess if we just have to think economically. So when power under capitalism, power tends to be concentrated and accumulated. So when power gets so concentrated in one man or one group, the other groups which become alienated, they also look for their survival. So they're tempted to make some radical choices. And I need to remind you and our readers as well, if they have followed politics here, that those people those parties who are protesting now, especially Democratic Bulgaria, they used to be part of the second government of Borisov. So they were protesting against the third one, but their ministers were part of the second one. And Bulgaria is an oligarchy, so that is another element of our talk on authoritarianism. And the low voter turnout at the last elections is another. I think it is at least partially explained by the fact that people realize you don't vote even for ideas. There are no visions. Even the protesters didn't propose a vision for reformation and modernization of society. They only speak about that, but they don't have something tangible with goals, with indicators, what is success, etc. So people realize that you vote for a certain economic interest. You have freedom to choose between, if I simplify or make it very in a stupid way, you can choose between pro-Western or pro-Eastern oligarchs, or maybe not like that, but you can choose between good oligarchs and bad oligarchs. But in any case, you can't choose a party, especially the left. If we need to discuss the left, that might be important. There is no party which supports the interest of workers or some social movements. Bulgaria is known for lack of grassroots movements. Romania, for example, has movements for housing, right to city or right to housing. It has also other movements related to feminism. And even though Bulgaria also might have a little bit of those tendencies, but grassroots activism in Bulgaria is, in my view, inexistent.
Yeah.
So, all these factors and maybe also other aspects explain why people don't feel empowered in Bulgaria. And I think those protests of the last year, they had the potential to carve out some progressive way for the future. But eventually they didn't do it, just because what we have are games of those who have economic power. We have corporations and we have oligarchs. So that is also a dilemma before, I think, the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe. We have either some kind of, if I simplify again, pro-Western or corporatist capitalism, or some kind of capitalism with Asian values, as they say, which is one of the oligarchs. And to finish, the left in these countries, no matter how small or weak it is, I think it has. You asked what is the way. I think you asked, should we trust the EU, but also what is the way for the people. The left has this potential to be an internationalist current. So I guess the left from our region has the potential to transcend borders, and maybe this cross-border activity, which even we are practicing now, can empower a number of people in our countries, and maybe it could bring some change.
Yeah, well, sure. There are some tendencies in Eastern Europe that are, that look at least pretty hopeful, and perhaps something's going to come out of it. But over the overall situation seems pretty bleak, by and large, and still, I want to stick to the question whether we really had a choice, and whether this authoritarianism that we can observe in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Hungary, in Russia, in Belarus, whether this is really something like the West would like everyone to see it, some kind of pathological incident, that something happened, and that's very bad. And of course, I don't like authoritarian tendencies, but I don't think that this was an incident. On the contrary, I see these as a natural development of everything that has been piling up over the last, say, 30, 40 years, okay? Because, and Malgorzata, I want to go to you now. Again, let's speak about let's speak about history for a short while. Because, at the break of the 90s, okay, no one really no one was programming, okay, the transition in a way that let's reform those countries, let's help them democratize, let's help them develop a different sort of political culture, let's show them some good practices from the West, like how they can enter into some kind of substantial dialogue, like the powers that be with with civic organizations and so on and so forth, how whatever small business initiative can work in favor of the economy, and so on and so forth, right? No, they didn't want to do that. Okay, so they were not really interested in democracy. What they were interested in is capitalism, and what they were interested in, and you can see that the perfect lab clean example of this was the annexation of East Germany by the West, by West Germany, and by the West, in general, right? Because that's exactly what happened, right? I mean, you can see that you can see that very, very clearly. They just took over. They closed down all their factories, like basically the entire industrial competition, okay, that used to exist until early 90s in the GDR, that is East Germany. Okay, and that's pretty much what happened throughout Eastern Europe. So everything that occurred was basically well, again, by and large, okay, was theft, privatization, primitive accumulation of capital, if you like, okay, to again use a classical Marxist jargon, okay, no democracy really, because I mean, come on, look at what happened in Romania in the beginning of the 90s. Look at what happened in Bulgaria in the beginning of the 90s with all the political killings and mafia emergence and so on and so forth. Like, where was the democracy? The democracy was nowhere. It was chaos. It was poverty. It was a general disaster. Okay, that's what it was. I mean, things have gotten worse, not better. Okay, I'm talking at least now. I mean, I'm talking about the beginning of the 90s or the first half of the 90s at least. I mean, you can't argue really if you want to stay rational that things have immediately gotten better. In some cases, like in case of Poland, for example, certain things have gotten better, and the Polish authorities did manage to build on whatever has not been destroyed throughout the 90s, and the Polish economy in comparison with the Romanian or with the Bulgarian or with the whatever Moldovan, if you like, is obviously a much more successful case. But what I'm trying to say is that authoritarianism has been with or inside embedded in the system of transition and the restoration of capitalism since the very beginning. So there is no surprise really for a rationally thinking person, okay, that now it's just getting a political representation. And of course, those from the West that were so happy and clapping hands about how we're, departing from communism and the lack of democracy and authoritarian regime, those that were clapping their hands at that now are dissatisfied because the process got a little bit out of control, and they now have to deal with a monster, okay, that they have basically groomed themselves. And again, Małgorzata, you and I, we have been on the left for a long time now, okay, and we have we have a solid record of warning people or trying to warn people via all kinds of independent outlets, like, guys, this is not going the way you feel it's going to go. This is not going the way, like Fukuyama put it in his nonsensical book, the end of history. No, it's not really going to be, a liberal democracy and capitalist economy thriving all over the place. On the contrary, it's going to end up in some kind of weird. And Kaczynski is weird even by our Eastern European standards. Okay, so in some kind of weird authoritarian right-wing experiment, and this is what is playing itself out right now before our very eyes. So do you agree with this historical perspective? I mean, has authoritarianism been with us since the very beginning of the capitalist restoration? That is, it is a different authoritarianism than the one we've had before 1989, but it's still authoritarianism. And, we did have some pauses, some breaks, and some democratic mechanisms did play themselves out. But in the final aftermath, this is the end of that road.
Okay, well, again, you talked a lot. There are a lot of points I could refer to, but let me just stick to one thing, at least for a moment. You mentioned the end of Francis Fukuyama's prophecy that now has been revoked even by its own author, who admitted to be totally wrong. And honestly, I don't know what did the Western architects of the transformation think as of the future of the Eastern Europe. I don't know if they imagined that we Eastern Europeans are gonna set some political parties, and then they are just going to go. And then they are going to have some political rivalry, and we will just live in this democratic system and so on. I don't know how did they imagine that, but I know that in the very beginning of the 90s in Poland there happened one thing in the party system that in fact paved the way for future right-wing authoritarianism, and I think that was the denial for the left, for the Social Democrats, to be an equal political force in Poland. Of course, it was not decreed as the Communist Party in Poland dissolved itself. It was not banned. But from the very beginning of the 90s, we heard that there is no place for the left in the new democratic system, that the left had already the chance to rule Poland and it failed. And now, as one of the journalists put it, the left in Poland can do less than other parties. And in this moment, when left was virtually pushed to the margins of the political life and it did not have courage in itself to stand to this discourse, we were actually put onto the way of the neoliberal hegemony in the discourse that had to end up with some kind of reaction. And so here I agree with you absolutely. Then we, given the fact that we castrated our political debate at the beginning, we had to end up with a guy like Kaczynski, who just invented, who just chose some elements of Polish political traditions and proposed his conservative, Catholic, paternalist, pseudo social care system, which actually could work much better hadn't he had he stressed much more the social issues than the conservative part of his program. But and what I think that this may refer to many other countries in the region as well, to the Baltic states in particular, when the left wing was also told at the very beginning of the transformation that it is not welcome in the country, that the future belongs to national forces, the conservative forces, and the social democrats are guilty of
And
everything
no one
bad.
protested. No one protested in the West.
Indeed. Nobody saw nothing wrong about that, and even worse, the West helped to strengthen this ultra anti-communist discourse, making us leftists to be permanently sorry for what Stalin did and for everything bad that happened in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And recently we had elections in Moldova, and I had the opportunity to talk to a left-wing commentator from Moldova who told me that one of the tragedies of political life in his country was that immediately after the so-called democratic transformations, the left-wingers were pushed to the corner, and the political scene was modeled in this way, that the left must be pro-Russian, must be sorry for Stalin, and at the same time it can't really propose any anti-capitalist measures because we already tried anti-capitalism and it did not work. And I think that it is the same mechanism, as I said, the same mechanism took place in many other countries in the region. And given the fact that the people were deprived of this part of political debate, people were deprived of possibility of thinking how to make capitalism better, even in a limited way. Well, it had to end up with somebody from the right wing who appears as a good leader of the nation, who cares of the nation, and who will build his own institutions, who will deprive people of democratic liberties, perhaps, but will take care of people and not make them fall into capitalist instability. So yes, in this context, I absolutely agree that the roots of authoritarianism date back to the so-called democratic transformation. And said this, I don't want to say that this must have happened because there is nothing like must in history, but it was highly probable from the very beginning.
Right. The question of political culture was raised by Vladimir earlier, and I'd like to speak about that for a little while. I'd like you, Maria, particularly to speak about that for a while, because, what is authoritarianism essentially? Of course, like when you look at the mainstream Western media, you're going to go like, oh, authoritarianism is terrible because it goes after LGBT community, or like in Poland or Hungary, or it goes after whatever women's rights, like in Poland, or whatever political opponents, like in Russia, allegedly, and so on and so forth. Right? Like this is how authoritarianism is presented. But essentially, authoritarianism is the kind of political culture where there are the masters, okay, or there is the master and I don't know, his acolytes, and then there are those people, somewhere. Those people. It would have been great if those people had if we didn't need those people, if the masters didn't need those people, because they would have had a state and they would have been able to do anything they like. Okay, and now when the people are there, they kind of have to consider it, and they have to enter into some kind of dialogue, or at least consider their existence. They have to make life bearable for them, and it's all such a heavy burden. Okay, and of course they don't want to listen to them, because those people, they have no idea. And this, by the way, is not exclusive to Eastern Europe. This is something that has been part of the Western culture since the emergence and the domination of the managerial class, and managerialism as the philosophy. Like, there are those who know and those who have no idea, and those who know need to like technocracy. I'd like you to elaborate on that, please, because you know much more about those notions than I do. But please, speak about the question of the culture and the political culture. And I think it also speaks to, again, something that Vladimir has taken up earlier, the notion of alienation. Because when it comes to political culture, many leftists also, not only right-wing people, but many leftists tend to say that, people are stupid. Our people, they are not mature enough in order to understand and exercise democracy, which is pure bullshit. I mean, I absolutely reject this kind of notion. It's not a matter of maturity, and it's not a matter of how educated you are. It's about being given a chance, okay, and about being allowed to be part of some process. And trust me, like if people are given a chance to have a say in something that is of vital interest for them, they will exercise their democratic right if it's there and if it's organized in a way that it can be actually achieved. And now we have people, because of poverty, because of all those things that we've been talking about here on this program, they are so alienated that they don't care anymore. Like, how do you expect people with the rate of poverty that you just explained a couple of minutes ago to care about democratic rights, democratic whatever values, European values, if you like? I even remember one Bulgarian journalist joking on the radio, on air, that European values, we'd like someone to define it for us, because I don't know, do you eat that with your breakfast, or I don't know, for lunch, or maybe in the evening? What do you do with European values? And it was it's a joke, okay, but it's a fair question. What do you do with this when you're hungry? Okay, so obviously the political culture has to be low. Please go ahead.
Well, of course it's low, and I told you, I quoted, and a lot of the right-wingers are quite surprised to find out that I quote for Isaiah Berlin, that one of their, stars, a person that they praise and admire, when he said that giving political civil liberties to poor people is to mock them. Now, authoritarianism is usually a form of government that rejects pluralism and wants to keep power, the status quo, and usually it does not like the separation of powers and the rule of law. Now, in 1964, there was this four, elements. It was defined in a famous book, four elements that characterize authoritarianism, and it is, as I said, limited political pluralism. The political legitimacy is based on emotions and creating emotional hype. And also maximum political mobilization and ill-defined executive powers. And now I would like to say that, as I told you, we witness right now overt authoritarianisms like the ones that we see in Kaczynski, where he wants to be perceived as this leader that is a paternalistic figure that is going to lead the nation to a brighter future, to a safer future. And you have the covert, so to speak, or more subtle forms of authoritarianism that have not been explored so far, as you said, because the left-wing forces were so weak and for the most part preoccupied with imitating debates from Western Europe and the United States on identitarian issues. Now, the problem with authoritarianism, as you said, especially in Romania, was that it is very difficult to have this democratic culture when all your life, you have a boss. And this is a peculiar thing that we replaced somehow Ceausescu and the centralization and centralized authoritarian regime with an undemocratic workplace where you have your little Ceausescu there, your boss. And we were working together for a number of years, and you were sometimes the witness of me being so afraid, in my workplace. And I'm a university professor. Just imagine what happens when you go down on the social ladder. And for me, some of my colleagues think I'm crazy just for being here with you, because all that fear that was, somehow centralized, and it was this power and authoritarianism was exercised from one center, just moved in the workplace. And how do you build a political culture that would not tend to authoritarianism when for the most part of your life you live in an undemocratic environment where you have a very small elite telling everyone else what to do and actually retaliating against those who oppose that elite? How do you build a democratic, culture when you don't have an association where you can go and you can, gather money and fight for your rights and express, your problems as a worker, as a woman that probably was harassed and so on and so forth? How do you build a political, culture when, again, the economic environment is so profoundly undemocratic and unfair and exclusive? Because we are talking about inclusivity, and we are taking this poisonous apple that the corporations are giving us while draping, their buildings into the rainbow flag. But at the same time, I would ask, do you have representatives of the workers in your managerial boards? Because, it is so easy to be diverse, but at the same time maintain this very strict and hierarchy in the workplace. And especially in Romania, since we had, this is very perverse. I mean, Slavoj Žižek would have something to say about this because he's so prone and he likes so much psychoanalysis. But in a way, Ceausescu survived in the next generation of managers that we had in Romania that thought that, that power that they had over their workers was so sweet to them, and they liked it so much. And it is true, unfortunately, that you don't see the kind of abuses in large corporations that you see in small firms in Romania. And that has to do also with the deregulation of the 90s and the fact that we did not have a Marshall Plan, to help us overcome and to help us democratize. They did not help us. Democracy was supposed to, just blossom like a flower here. And unfortunately, it did not happen. It was, a transformation from this centralized authoritarianism to decentralized authoritarianism.
Right.
And this is the situation right now.
Okay, so we're running rapidly out of time. I would like to invite you, Vladimir, now to perhaps continue this topic on, of political culture, because I think, and I'm not a specialist in political culture, political marketing, and political communication, that kind of stuff, but I'm my response as a left-wing commentator, activist to some extent, is that, look, if we want to overcome those political/cultural problems, then there's only one way to do that. The first thing, what you mentioned, is we got to have a vision. We got to have something which is not going to just have this technocratic appeal that we're going to make things better for you because we've got better mechanisms of power, which we do have better offer in this respect, of course, as the left. But still, like, we got to have a vision which is going to have an emotional appeal, which is going to, inspire people. And then you can start overcoming alienation by mobilizing people, because this is how you, I guess, like, I mean, please, all of you correct me if you feel that I'm wrong, but this is how you overcome alienation, by gathering people, by creating a sense of community, by creating a sense of a common goal, of a common good, of better future. This is how you overcome alienation, right? And no one cared really so far in Bulgaria or in other Eastern European countries, for that matter, to overcome that. Okay, so people are by and large alienated, and they are in this, they live under this terrible, in those terrible conditions that Maria just described perfectly. The dictatorship in the workplace, the dictatorship outside the workplace, and so on and so forth. And do you think that this is the way to go, that like, if we want to have grassroots movement in Bulgaria, then we have to start with some kind of active minority that will start to mobilize people, but not just by saying that we're better, or that we're going to, I don't know, take away, do away with the mafia, or I don't know, fix the judicial system and stuff like that, but that they are going to appeal to something more general, and that they could create an inspiration?
Well, there have been studies even back in the 70s. I think Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch is one of those studies about certain evolutions in societies and in people under in Western world, and those evolutions have been somehow transferred to us as we also learn to live in capitalism, and our institutions become homogenized in this sense. But also it's peculiar in our region, I think. I don't know about Western Europe, but we have a social form which is called mafia, and it's not only those criminals who somehow corrupt society and do some nasty things between themselves, but in a way, when you grow in Bulgaria, or maybe in other countries in the regions as well, you grow when you are able to form a mafia around you. It's a social model, and this model is peculiar. I think it has something to do with either with Orthodox countries or with Muslim countries. I'm not so I don't know so many countries, but I think it has something to do with this specific part of the world, as people care about their mafia because they live through it. Maybe mafia is not the exact word. Maybe it's an in-group. It's a better word for English speakers. But it is a group in which you dissolve and you live through it. And you don't care about others as long as they don't threaten you, or they don't present if they present some interest, some resource which you can use for your mafia, then you care about them. But on normal terms, this model of in-groups, it destroys solidarity. People, my impression, at least from Catholic countries, no matter how much you cry in Poland from authoritarianism, Catholic Church, in my view, has certain value for community, at least I think to a greater extent, while here in our part of the world, there is a value more for the in-group. And that's why we have the oligarchies as well. So, this is if you ask me how to change that, it is very difficult, of course, but I think some people always are unable to follow the model of the mainstream, and I think these people have to have certain places where they can gather and organize. And also, I think our media, in a way, has a function as an alternative media, or as a place for some people beyond the consensus in these societies in which we are present and active. Such initiatives, they can empower people. And as I mentioned, at least that's my own experience, cross-border communication, it has a great potential to empower, because maybe in your own country, in your province, let's say, or where you live in your country, you don't find this energy or resources or experience which can give you feeling, as to overcome alienation. But when you open to the world and in our case, we open to the region which we live in, you can find this energy, these experiences beyond your gloomy town or place. And I guess life is a struggle. You know, we can't resolve by magic all those problems, but it is important that people who are carrying certain change, like progressive change, it is important that they have their places or spots where they can flourish. And that, at least that's my solution for the time being.
Okay, and before I go to you, Małgorzata, for the last question here that I have, but I want to, because I saw, Maria, you were nodding your head when Vladimir spoke about the kind of connection or alleged connection between the Orthodox culture and the kind of authoritarian ideas or concepts that well, apparently this culture retains. Okay, so I want you to please, perhaps, comment on that or elaborate on that but briefly, okay, because we got to finish.
Well, very briefly, I would just say that for some time in Romania, the charity done by the Catholic Church here was more substantial than the whole charity missions that the Orthodox Romanian Church was involved in. And that should tell you something. That should tell you something, not about how greedy the Romanian Orthodox Church is, but it should tell you something about, exactly as Vladimir said, the cultural element. I mean, I hate when people say, oh, you like authoritarianisms and everything can be explained through your culture. No, it is a mixture of factors, but of course, I think Vladimir is right, and our culture plays a very important part. This type of Orthodox Church that is playing with the power and also resolving everything through informal channels, as I told you on previous shows, that the Romanian Orthodox Church is not a democratic militant one like the neo-Protestant ones in the United States. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it has to do also with the cultural background, because Romania was among the last to abolish this type of servitude of the peasants, in Europe. So this type of servitude of the peasants was the longest here in our country. And the communist era found us with almost 70% of the people illiterate, and most of them living in rural areas in conditions that you would not imagine. So these are the factors that we have to take into account when discussing, the flourishment of this authoritarianisms here.
Right. And the last 2 or maybe 3 maximum minutes of the program, I want to devote to Russia, because I intentionally didn't mention that before, because I was just afraid we're going to spend half of the time of the program discussing this and all the controversies around that country. So I left it for the, for the last 2 or 3 minutes. And Małgorzata, I want to go to you with this, and a very brief and very kind of quick question. Okay. Like, there are some legitimate complaints, okay, about, authoritarian tendencies in Russia and so on, and the political arrangement there not being entirely democratic or constitutionally democratic as it's understood in the West. But then, again, has anyone given Russia a chance? Because what happened after the dismantlement of the Soviet Union was, again, a civilizational disaster at every level, okay, in Russia. I mean, this was something that has no precedent, okay, in the history of the Russian state, okay, and then I wonder if the Russians were to prevent somehow the complete fall apart and disintegration of the Russian state and Brzezinski's wet dream playing itself out, that is the split of the Russian Federation into 5 or 6 different countries, 3 of which would probably resemble Afghanistan today, and the two other would resemble Moldova. Okay, so like how do you think it was possible without authoritarian measures? Because I just don't quite, frankly, I don't see how it would have been possible. Of course, I mean, my favorite scenario would be a socialist revolution, and and better socialism than the one that we've had before 1989. But this was not really the alternative at the break of the century. Okay, and I don't want to come across as someone who comes up with excuses for authoritarianism, but let's look at facts logically, okay, and let's apply basic logic to basic facts. Please go ahead, Malgorzata. Do you agree with this approach, or do you find it I don't know, over the top?
Well, if I am just to say what I want to say in 2 minutes, then I would say that if you allow an oligarchic system to grow, and if you allow a population of more than 140 millions to experience extreme poverty, and indeed what happened in Russia in 90s, that was absolute civilizational disaster and the growth of extreme inequalities, then you have basically two possible scenarios for the future. One is that somebody in all this chaos wants to take the lead in the country, and inevitably it descends into authoritarianism. And the second is is basically what Brzezinski envisaged for Russia. So the split in more entities. Actually, both scenarios were possible for a while, and the fact that Russia ended up with an authoritarian regime was quite an expected outcome of the events. So really, there is nothing to be particularly surprised with. And as far as the West and Russia is concerned, I would like to give one more historical example. I already talked today about 1970 in the Russian Revolution and the radical attempts to build a democratic society. Let me remind you what happened after that revolution, when it was really yet unclear what kind of political system could come out of the chaos. What did the Western countries do? Did they support the new government, or at least look at it with a kind of interest? No, they supported the reaction. They supported the whites. So the people who wanted to impose dictatorship in Russia, the dictatorship that could have been much more bloody than anything that the Tsars did. So, well, the West never really cared about democracy in Russia, and really never wished anything good for Russian people, nor allowed them to choose the system and build it in relatively positive conditions. And so, well, if in the end the Russians vote for a leader who offers them some kind of stability and tells them that they will be able to stand up to any kind of intervention, well, I am not really surprised by the fact that they trust him. What will he do now when the memory of the 90s is kind of fading away, particularly in the minds of the younger generation? That is an open question, and this is a big challenge to the Russian government. But again, this is a topic for another discussion.
Right. And on that note, I want to thank our guests in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland. Thank you so much for the analysis, for the insightful remarks. And I want to thank our viewers. And I want to invite everybody to check out theanalysis.news and to click on the donate button there, and to check out the barricade.online, and to go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/thebarricade, and to check out the the YouTube channels of the respective platforms. Thanks so much again, and stay healthy and keep fighting. And we're going to see each other hopefully sometime soon. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.